Hi, thank you so much for joining us for tonight's live Q&A for Little America. I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and before we welcome tonight's guest, I just want to let you know how the evening is going to flow. If you're joining us here live in Zoom, you will see at the bottom of your screen is a box that says Q&A. So if you have any questions for Lee, please throw those into the Q&A box. You can throw them in at any point. I'll be keeping an eye on those throughout the evening to jump to those. And then please feel free as well and welcome to also use the chat box to have conversations with each other as the evening continues. But again, just make sure if you have a question for Lee that goes into the Q&A box. Otherwise, we won't see it. And without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce co-creator and executive producer of Little America, Lee Eisenberg.
Hi.
Hi, thanks so much for joining us this evening. I feel like this has been such an incredible journey that you've had with this series. And I wanted to start by diving back to the initial creation and structuring out of all of these episodes, because I think one of the challenges that always exists with any anthology series is that you're telling all of these individual unique stories that have their own emotional beats, their own arcs that they're taking. But at the same time, there has to be this through thread that really makes them feel connected. And with this series in particular, every single episode feels completely connected to all of the other ones. So when you were first creating and writing these episodes as a team, what were the challenges in making sure that they really threaded into each other? Because they're all so individually unique in such special ways.
Yeah, I think that it's tricky. You know, I can't remember how many stories we got initially. It was probably something along the lines of 70 or 50 that we were parsing through. And sometimes what makes sense as a kind of a first person narrative doesn't entirely translate as well for 30 minutes. Sometimes stories felt like movies. And so we really kind of talked about, we just had to connect to the subjects. And we started feeling like the themes that we were trying to tackle, we wanted to tackle universal themes. And I think what was special about the stories is that we were taking characters that you don't often see prominently on screen and putting them kind of at the top of the call sheet or, you know, in the foreground. But the stories are really, they're universal. They're about love, they're about loss, they're about identity. And I think that was the thing that was so important for us to capture.
And the narrative structure within each of them is so interesting because there's some stories that have really natural conclusions, like I want to open a bakery and then I've managed to achieve my goal. Whereas sometimes it's, well, I went on a cruise and it wasn't what I expected and I saw a glacier, or I was trying to break down a rock and I didn't succeed and that's still an ongoing thing for me. So there's a lot of kind of loose open ends at the same time. So particularly with those ones that didn't have your traditional narrative structure ending, how did you work to kind of like lead us into the ending and still make sure that it had that satisfying feeling, that it left us with that emotional feeling of hopefulness, even though it's completely open-ended?
That was something we talked about a lot. And we didn't want to have stories where every single episode kind of ended in a tidy, you know, the tidy bow, and that this idea that you come here and that all your dreams are going to be fulfilled right away or in the way that you expected. That's not real life. And that's not the way that we wanted to tell these stories. And so I think, to us, we always felt like, okay, what's the endpoint that makes sense, that's resonating for us as storytellers, and let's head towards that. And sometimes that meant that it ends with, you know, somebody winning the big tournament or not winning the big tournament, or, you know, or breaking the rock or not breaking the rock. And we tried to kind of find all the moments that for us, it just resonated as a character. And so you want a character to feel some sense of completion, and the completion could feel big, like the baker episode, and others are small moments. It's like in the Syrian episode, him being in the nightclub at the end, and just that was just a feeling of release. And you saw that he ended his, you know, he was able to kind of come to terms a little bit with his relationship with his father, but it's a story about freedom and about identity, and that felt like the appropriate place for that to end. And then a lot of the stories, you know, we talked to Apple a lot from the beginning about the postscripts and how do we want to treat them. And again, these are not, we didn't want it to feel like everything was, all your answers were going to be fulfilled, but also at the same time we wanted to give you like little kind of kernels to kind of, or sorry, breadcrumbs to kind of, I knew there's a small thing I was looking for, breadcrumbs to kind of track you a little bit and give you a little taste. And, you know, for some of the episodes, having watched it now with a lot of crowds, it's so interesting at what moments people kind of feel that emotion, that emotional connection or pow. And in the cruise episode you were talking about, some people like got really emotional when they find out that it's actually his story. And so the episode, you're enjoying it, and there are moments that, I think are working for the audience, but it's not until the postscript that you see the photos that you realize, like, oh my God, the personal connection to these stories.
Yeah. And there's such an art form to the way that even when you do have those stories that don't end in complete resolution, going back to the final episode where you were mentioning that he's in the club, and yes, he's found this sense of freedom, but it doesn't resolve his relationship with his father and with his family, or the manager where his parents are now here with him, but he's completely heartbroken because all he's thinking about in that moment is everything that they've lost and the relationship that they don't have from not spending time together. But at the same time, you still feel hopefulness for all of these characters. Was that something that in the writers' rooms that you were talking about, always wanting to weave that in, no matter what these characters were facing, that you didn't want to create a quick solve, but that you still wanted that to be the emotional undertone of all of these stories, and particularly what you wanted us to walk away with at the end of each of them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so much of the, I'd spent a long time in comedy rooms before this. I worked on The Office for a long time, and I worked on some other comedies. And in a comedy room, you might spend a day on a 4-line sequence and trying to just get the language just right so that the joke lands at the end of it. And with Little America, it was about trying to find these really authentic emotional moments that we didn't want it to feel treacly. We didn't want it to feel like we're cloying or that we're trying to get the audience to a place. We wanted it to feel real. We wanted it to feel earned, and we wanted it to feel, and we did want it to feel emotional. It's like sometimes the endings were messy, and it was really, when we started talking about the order of the episodes, and it's funny, like we spent hours and days debating and emails and chains and all that stuff about what the order was, like the way you're kind of creating a playlist for your friends in middle school. And then I started getting friends and relatives started to watch the show, and they're like, "Oh, I watched the Baker one, and then I watched the Chinese one, and then we jumped over to the Syrian one. We watched half of this one." And you're like, "No, no, 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 no! You have to start." We spent so much time, like we were building a season, and but we, starting with the manager episode, that one does have a kind of a real melancholy at the end of it, and part of that was we wanted to tell the audience not every episode is going to end with, oh, well, his family came back, so of course, if your family comes back, then everything, all your prayers are answered. So it was really trying to find that balance that we don't, it wasn't kind of challenging the audience, but just like letting the audience know that these are the types of stories that we want to tell.
Yeah. And I wanted to talk about the writers' rooms that you constructed, because not only did you make a really conscious effort to have writers who were from the countries of the stories that you were telling, but you also ended up with a lot of writers that didn't come from traditional television storytelling. They came from a multitude of backgrounds. You had playwrights who were in the room. And particularly when you're writing a show like this that doesn't have a traditional 30-minute made for television, like leading into the ad break, creating a cliffhanger at the end of the episode to draw you into the next one, how did that actually really benefit the entire process when you already had writers who are used to working in completely different mediums and different structures?
I love storytelling, and I love storytellers, and I don't care that much about the way that they're telling the stories or the way that they had told the stories. And so I think the the things that I look for in a writer, I looked for regardless if I'm reading a half hour or a movie or a play, or there was a writer we were going to hire off of an article. Like, I mean, it was all, they all kind of came from different places. I think that the show really lives in specificity, and that when you have a show where there aren't crazy stakes, or that, the twists aren't that, it turns out that's, there's a crazy kidnapping, but, like all the moves that you would do in Scandal, we did not have those at our, in our quiver. And so I think you really need to kind of hone in on moments. And what is that table like? What is that family dinner like? What is it like? What kind of bike does he use to get from here to there? And you just started talking about all these things. And what was so fun in the room, and then talking to all the individual writers, is you just got so many personal stories. As people are like, I co-wrote the Persian episode with Kumail Nanjiani and Emily Gordon, and the character, like when we were the subject, we read all these transcripts, and he had like 18 businesses. He was like he was a beekeeper and he ran a parking lot, and then he sold pistachios. Like they were just like we had it in the show. I can't remember if it ended up in the final cut. His business card, and his business card has like every job that he has, and it reminded me a lot of my dad. And my dad's from Israel, and he's obsessed with Shark Tank. And I felt like Shark Tank is like such an American show, and like you can come to this country and with like, one idea, and Mark Cuban gives you a check for $1 million. And so we just kind of took the Shark Tank thing from my dad, and it felt very appropriate for the character, but that was a way that we kind of filled it out. And people were doing things like that all of the time. And so everyone was just approaching it from such a personal place. And I really never worked on a show before where there was such passion for this, for the subjects and for the stories that we were telling. People were, because they were telling personal stories, because they were telling stories of people that from a country that their parents were from or that they were from, that, telling Ugandan story. There are not a lot of Ugandan stories on TV. So the opportunity as a Ugandan writer to tell that story, it felt important. It felt like you were, there was a responsibility you had to tell that story, in the best possible way. And top to bottom, all the writers really brought that. And it was the directors, the directors were all from, as much as we could, from countries of origin or immigrants themselves. The editors, it was really the kind of the creative team of the show. It really felt like people were kind of imbuing it with their own personal tales.
Yeah, and then as well as the writers having access to the subjects whose stories you were telling, you also had cultural consultants working on the show as well. And so because you already had that direct access to these personal stories and so many details of what that experience was and the emotional journey that it had been for them, what were the ways in which the cultural consultants really helped to shape elements of the scripts for you all?
The cultural consultants, they were around for the scripts, and then also on set a lot. So what's the music playing in the, during the dinner scene here? What magazines would be on the table there? They would never serve nuts that way, And so you start, and it matters. Like the response that we got on social media, it really felt like people said, like, that looks like my grandmother's living room. That looks like my friend's house. That's the office of, of my coworker, whatever it was. And I think that the production design and the amount of research that we spent and having the cultural consultants and the dialect coaches, all of that really, it was such a team effort to kind of put together a place that when you walked in, it felt like, oh, it felt so authentic.
Yeah. And then thinking about the Rock episode, there's that moment where he says to the realtor, I actually had a really great life. Like I didn't come here because I was running away from something, and exactly what you were saying, where he had all of these incredible entrepreneurial jobs that he was doing and was a business owner. And that you had a really conscious effort as writers in that you never wanted to say kind of like back in my country. And did you always know from the offset that you wanted to have a story that really expressed the point that not every immigrant story is someone running away from something and fleeing something, but sometimes it's just wanting something a little bit different from what you have and wanting to try a new place?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't, we really made a conscious effort. The point of the show was not that America is the answer, and that if you come here that, this is some sort of panacea. It was, everyone has different experiences. And it was important for us. That was one of the first scripts that we wrote, to kind of let people know, to remind the executives at Apple, to remind the other writers, to remind us that not everyone comes to the United States when they're running away from something. There's tons of reasons why people come. In the Silent episode, that was a story that you kind of learn her story at the very end of it. And it's kind of almost this, she hasn't spoken in a week, and she kind of gives all of her dialogue over the course of, 2 minutes. But that was a character, that's someone who's searching and thought that coming to the United States would kind of provide her with answers, and she didn't have any, and she didn't understand, she didn't like it. And that was a kind of an exciting thing. And as we've been talking about kind of what season 2 looks like, kind of giving all these different impressions of what it is. And in the Syrian episode, it does feel like a release, and there was kind of this freedom that he wasn't able to have. And then in the Cowboy episode, it's like he doesn't fit in, and then there's moments where he does, but he also feels very connected to his friends from growing up, and he's getting food from his mother, and he's imagined, like, there's all these different things where there's homesickness. Sometimes it is the best choice for them, sometimes it's the wrong choice. And so we wanted to explore all of it and not declare like every story is going to be X.
Yeah. And you've talked about how with the Cowboy episode that there's certain details that you got from all of these conversations with the subjects that as writers, you maybe never would have been able to facet into your imagination, like the detailing of the thoughts that he has about hamburgers. You may not conceptualize that. What were some of the other details in other episodes that you felt that same way about?
Well, just to quickly for the hamburger thing, you're sitting in a writer's room and you spend hours and hours trying to come up with the right, okay, he's in elocution class. Like, what could he talk about in elocution class? And, everyone's, trying to come up with their own thing. And then someone's like, I remember something from the transcript. And you go back through these 80-page transcripts and you just find, or somebody got on the phone with him at one point, and all of a sudden he just went on this rant about hamburgers. And it was like, oh, what's more American than a hamburger? And so this Nigerian cowboy talking about how much he doesn't like hamburgers and breaking it down in a way that you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. We should not be eating hamburgers. That's an insult to the meat. Was really fun. In the Syrian episode, one of the writers went to the house of the subject, or maybe like when they're doing they were photographing them for the Epic magazine story. And over their fireplace, I believe, they had a giant oil painting of the couple. So they had like a gigantic oil painting of themselves that was just hung over the fireplace. And it was like the most prominent piece of art in the room. And that was something they were like, oh, immediately, like the most important piece of production design that we can find for this episode is we need to have an oil painting. So we had to hire an artist to do it. First, we need to cast the actors, and then the timing of when like how long it would take to make the oil painting versus, I think we got one of the actors and we didn't get the actress, but that was a detail that was really important to us. And then in the motel episode, the director of that, Deepa Mehta, who's incredible, and she had all these details that she really wanted. And, we had, he was a speller. And so it was like, okay, well, how do you kind of show a kid learning how to spell, but make it feel lived in? And so like she kind of came up with like him playing the piano and saying the things, or shooting the baskets. And it was just kind of bring all those like little kind of flares to it as they went into the directing of it.
Yeah. And you were mentioning the episode where there's the silent retreat earlier. And I thought it was interesting that episode was actually originally written with more dialogue, that Zachary Quinto's character was doing these guided meditations as opposed to being a silent character throughout most of it himself. What was the moment in post-production where you realized that you wanted to make that drastic shift to what you'd originally conceptualized for that episode?
The writer and director of that, Sean Hayter, who just won Sundance with her movie Coda, which was very cool. It was an episode we had a few from the beginning that were like, okay, we have to do a silent episode because we haven't seen that on TV. And then in those silent retreats, there's often someone who's kind of a guide who's walking the subjects through their experience. And we watched it. It was excellent. The first cut of it was great. We just really felt like there was an episode there. And then we started experimenting with it, and it was like, it's a silent episode. What if there was more silence? And I think the first thought was, let's just see what it feels like if the first 7 minutes there's no dialogue, and what is that like? And then it was scary, and also took a long time to cut out all the dialogue. And also Zachary was one of the bigger actors we had in the show. And generally when you have a big actor, they want to speak on camera, and the audience is kind of waiting to hear him speak. And so it was pretty ambitious. And we were nervous also that Apple was going to say like, great, you're late on this cut, put all the dialogue back. That's insane. And so we did the 7 minute we tried the 7 minutes, and then we just kind of incrementally kept going. And it's kind of like what he says in the episode. It's like words matter, and the words kind of matter when they don't exist for the whole thing. And that episode's very polarizing. I think that it makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable. But I also think that it's the type of episode where you can't really take your eyes off the screen because it's so because it's so surprising. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like they're not, that surely sooner or later, there's going to be a line of dialogue.
Yeah, it's the one episode that kind of takes you tonally into a slightly different place for a moment from the other ones, because all of a sudden you find yourself very quiet in watching it. Was that kind of the intention of that decision?
Yeah, well? That was exactly it. And then and you start finding visual ways to tell stories. You start finding comedy in the silence. You start finding comedy in way, like that episode I think is one of the funnier ones, and you find things in it that you wouldn't have otherwise had.
Did someone have to pick up the phone and call Zachary Quinto to tell him that he no longer had any lines?
Sean and Zachary were, I think they're like best friends, and they went to college together. So she got to break the news to him.
And then also, even when you were structuring out the narrative of some of the scripts, I know that you found that sometimes the story as it was didn't naturally lend itself to the way that it was best told cinematically on screen. And I'm thinking about the Baker episode, where in real life she had a partner with her the whole time, and that was part of the journey. But when you scripted it that way, it kind of distracted the focus a little bit and needed to be a bit more succinct. And there were some squirrels in there that were stealing all the food. I won't lie, I slightly wish the squirrels were there and that we'd gotten to see that part.
About all the different drafts with squirrels.
Yeah, but I was interested in the journeys that a lot of the scripts took in starting to shape them around what the actual story of the subject was, and then the journey that you would take them on in thinking about what really worked for that succinct 30-minute storytelling on screen.
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing to us was we wanted to be authentic to the spirit of the story, and we weren't doing a documentary, and we never wanted it to feel like, okay, and then this thing happened and this thing happened, and now you're watching every moment of someone's life. That wasn't really it. It was, these are short stories, and I think they live best when they have a little bit of a kind of a concentrated through line. And so we debated it, and we were also terrified to, we were so concerned about the subjects. The subjects were not people that are in Hollywood that understand how stories evolve. And so bringing them into the process and letting them understand and letting them see their episodes and having them respond the way that they did, which was very positive, was a huge relief, and also made us feel really proud of the time that we spent on the episodes. But yeah, they're definitely, in an episode like that, it was, what is the story that we want to tell, and what is the core relationship we want to focus on? And so many of them kind of came down to family or a spouse or a lover. And it was like, how are you managing that? And then in a half hour, you end up pulling out these chunks that it's not that they shouldn't belong in someone's story. It just, they didn't belong in the half hour version of the story that we were trying to tell with the themes that we were trying to tackle.
And in telling a half-hour story, I feel like you all packed in such a monumental amount of story, character, emotional journey. And particularly when you have the episodes where you're jumping in time as well. The Manager takes place across roughly around 10 years, I think. And to tell a story that crosses 10 years in half an hour really succinctly and have that guttural emotional punch at the end is such an achievement. What are the challenges of trying to pull that off?
Some of the stories, like, the silent episode takes place over 7 days. The Manager takes place over, 10 years or whatever it is. And the Rock probably takes place over the course of 8 months. And the Syrian episode takes place over years. And so the cruise ship is over the course of, 4 days. And so I think it was really what was appropriate to the story we wanted to tell. And, when you're doing an anthology, like you said from the beginning, you want it to all feel of a piece. But within that, each episode really needed to stand on its own. And we never wanted to start every single episode with the country of origin. And then, there's a chyron that comes up and says 3 years later, and now they're in the States and whatever. So we did flashbacks. Some episodes have none. Some are from a childhood. Some are from a day ago. And we just wanted to play with form. And I think that, as the show kind of continues to evolve, we want to continue playing with that form.
Yeah, there's also a lot of really beautiful, tiny, nuanced moments in every single one of the episodes about human connectivity and the small ways that we do that. One example is on the cruise ship episode when the mom and her son have had an argument earlier in the day. And then when she comes back to the room at night and her son is asleep, the first thing that she does is walk over and pull his covers up over him and kind of tuck him in
Yeah.
still. Was what were the different kind of minute ways that you thought about a lot of little touches like that, because each story has its own way of needing that to live and breathe with its characters?
I mean, I don't know that there's anything. I'm trying to think other
Mm.
examples of that one in particular really jumps out to me. We spent a long time talking about music, and we had a great music supervisor, but like just finding like how did that stuff. Sorry, my dogs are playing at the table. Just finding ways where just anything just felt. I keep going back to the word authenticity, but like it was just everything that was something that was very important to us.
Yeah. And we have a question from John that came in who's asking about what was the hardest episode to translate from story to screen in an episode?
The hardest episode. They were all hard in their own ways. I mean, it was just there was no episode that I think we had a clear with the. Sorry, hold on one second.
Working from home, it's all of our worlds now.
This is what Zooming is.
Yeah.
I think the silent episode was one that we kind of had a clear idea of what we wanted. It was really hard because there was so little dialogue, and as writers, dialogue is how you kind of you relay exposition, and so telling a story like that on it without dialogue was a real challenge. But we also had a very kind of clear idea of what we wanted the episode to be. And so I'm trying to think, like the Baker episode was challenging. I think that one was kind of one of the later ones, and we felt like we were kind of getting close. And then there were moments where it's like, oh, does this feel like if we quite got this right? And then the casting of that one, I just thought she was so strong, and that kind of enlivened it. And then once we saw her doing it, it was like, oh, okay, I think the actress was so great that I think she helped us in some of the moments that I was like, oh, is this cheesy? Is this not working? And she was so believable and so invested that I connected to it so much.
Yeah. This next question is from Sophie, who's asking, what was the collaborative relationship with you, Kamel, Emily, and Alan? Were you all just as involved in every single episode, or did you divide them up to a degree with each other?
So Emily, Alan, and Kumail were the first people that I called to work. I'd been friends with all of them for years. And as I was just kind of thinking about the tone that I was looking for the show, the reference points I kept giving were The Big Sick and Master of None. And I was like, well, it'd be nice if I got some of the people that worked on those shows to kind of help us out here. And so me and Kumail and Emily wrote the pilot, or it wasn't the pilot, but it was the kind of the first script, the Rock episode. And then Alan was involved with all of them. Kumail and Emily were involved with all of them. I was the showrunner of the show, so I was in the writer's room. And then they were weighing in on casting. They were weighing in on post, on outlines, on scripts, and everything like that. Alan was kind of the producer in charge of the Chinese episode, the one on the cruise ship. And he got to go down to Florida and go back and forth. I think they went to the Bahamas, like just back and forth. That was the route. And so that was kind of his episode that we tried to get every writer and producer to kind of oversee one of the episodes.
Yeah. And we have a question from Jerry about the fact that the show was made at the time that the travel ban was in effect, and did that affect your production in any way and cause you to make any changes?
There was an issue with casting for the Syrian episode, and it just limited us. And we ended up shooting that episode in Canada. And part of the reason we shot in Canada was it opened up some casting options for us. And the other issue was trying to recreate Syria and Amman, Jordan in New Jersey, where we were shooting. And by the way, New Jersey did great. New Jersey was Nigeria, and New Jersey was India, and New Jersey did a lot of heavy lifting, but kind of finding those kind of cobblestone streets and a little bit of that older feel, that was going to be a little bit of a challenge. And I think we were going to sacrifice a little bit creatively. And the director of that episode, Stephen Dunn, who's excellent, he had spent a lot of time and shot in Montreal before and said, we need to shoot in Montreal. And I thought there's no chance that we're going to be able to shoot one episode on location. And to the credit of our producer and everyone in Universal and Apple, they made it work. And so all of a sudden it was the last episode we shot, and we all just kind of packed up, and there was a crew waiting for us from Montreal, and it looked incredible. It really felt like there was so much production value added for that.
Given how many places New Jersey stood in for, but at the same time you did film in a multitude of locations, how did you make the choice creatively of when you could use New Jersey or somewhere else for another location, and when you needed to actually be in that location for a story?
I mean, New Jersey's the MVP. New Jersey did really, I mean, I think it played 6 countries and 5 states. And so, we were just kind of traveling all around New Jersey, but the cruise ship we shot on a cruise ship, the flashbacks to China we shot in New Jersey, and the Syrian episode we shot all in Montreal, and that was it. And then everything else, we just made it work. I mean, there's definitely some CGI and some VFX going on, but we found just incredible locations, and the production designers were fantastic, and they just made things work. It was crazy. I mean, we added mountains to the to Utah where the motel was. It was completely flat, and all of a sudden when you look, it looks like the Rocky Mountains. So there were things that we added in post, but it was kind of a combination of practical locations, some really good set design, and then some good old-fashioned VFX. We did not see a glacier when we were going to the Bahamas, as an example of something that was added.
And in terms of the production on this series, it's incredibly ambitious in what you actually managed to achieve, because every single episode required a completely different production design, completely different cast. There were no elements that were crossing over that you could use again in the next episode at any point. And even what you're saying about filming in a multitude of different locations, what were the challenges as a showrunner in trying to oversee essentially 8 individual productions compared to anything that you've ever worked on before?
I mean, the real challenge was keeping my inbox under 800 emails every day, because for the exact reason that you're bringing up, there were, hey, can you approve the location photos for the cruise ship? And we have wardrobe for the Syrian episode, and you need to look at the cut for this. It was really like shooting 8 pilots or 8 mini movies, not quite simultaneously, but there was overlap. There was not a single episode that was done before the last one was shot. And so we had 2 directors of photography. We had one, Dave Franco, who had worked on Game of Thrones. The other one, Paula Udibro, who had worked on Barry, who were incredible, both immigrants. And so they were just kind of toggling back and forth for those, for their episodes. We had 2 production designers. We had 1 costumer, which seems insane because we're doing the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. But he had a huge crew with him, and multiple ADs. We basically just had to have 2 crews going at once, and they had their own kind of infrastructure, so there was no overlap. Like the same production designer did the same episodes with the same DP, so they kind of created a shorthand, and then the directors were the ones that were coming in, but we gave the directors a lot of prep time, longer than you normally would get for a half hour, because they were really starting from scratch. I think I can't remember how many days we shot for the whole series, let's say 60 days, maybe 70 days. And we did, I think, 1 day or half a day on a sound stage. And on anything else I've ever worked on, it would be 50 days on a sound stage and 10 days out, or 40, it would be half and half. So everything was a practical location, and it was really, it was a challenge.
Yeah. We have this question from Lisa, who's asking, for season 2, are any of the stories that you're telling ones that you had wanted to visit in season 1, but just didn't have the space and time for, or did you look for entirely new stories that you hadn't come across yet?
There were a few that kind of filtered in a little bit late during season 1 that we were excited about, and we were hoping that the show would turn out okay so that they would give us a season 2. And what was great is Epic Magazine, that did the initial art stories, they turned it into a book. And so all of a sudden we just got more detail, and we were able to kind of get a little bit more granular with the stories. And we talk about it, and the stories come from everywhere. I had an Uber driver that was from Croatia, and I just started talking to people about the show because you just never know where the stories are going to come from. And he told me this insane story about being in New York, and he lost his passport, and he had to go to the embassy, and it was wild. It felt like what's that movie, the Martin Scorsese movie from the 80s? I don't know, think about it. It's Crazy Night in New York. And anyway, people were just finding stories from everywhere, and we just started collecting them, and then we just started sifting through them, and really kind of, some of the things we learned from season 1, we got ahead of it a little bit more and talked to the subjects earlier. And also we would kind of go into the writer's room, and the writers, would start breaking the episode and realize, it would be great to kind of go back and ask him how he felt in this moment. So then we go back to the subjects, and the subjects were really a little bit more a part of the breaking of their episodes, which isn't to say that we still kind of, we did what was right for the story, and we really wanted to be respectful to them without kind of saying like, okay, I understand that, you were in Beverly Hills for 4 years. What if we made it 2 years, if that made the most sense? That sort of thing, like, to me, doesn't feel like it's compromising it. And they completely understood it. So, and then the writers would come in and say, hey, my friend did this, my friend did that. And then that would be a way that we would find stories.
And then the dogs would come in and bark and give their
dogs. We're going to tell a story about the dogs in season 2. It's going to be exciting.
Can't wait for that episode. It's already my favorite. And then I also wanted to talk quickly about working with the actors, because, you've talked about how for a lot of these actors, they'd often only been given stereotypical roles. So maybe they've only played the terrorist on Homeland or Jack Ryan, or they've only ever gotten the opportunity to be number 9 on a call sheet. And suddenly these actors are being given these beautifully complex characters. They're getting the opportunity to really lead and hold an episode, which is no small feat. There's a lot that comes with it beyond the performance that they're bringing in what they carry, how they're kind of leading the set in a different way, creating the environment. So how, as a showrunner and EP, did you work to really support them stepping into those positions and the new things that it was asking of them?
The casting process of the show was just so exciting because it always felt like discovery. And so among the EPs, it would be like, I think Emily saw Confidants, who played the Nigerian cowboy, first. And we were on the set, I believe, of the Rock, and we were just kind of sitting in between a break, and it was like, hey, you should check out, we should start looking at some of the casting. And then Emily texted our group and said, like, you need to watch this guy, like, you need to see this. And we watched it, and it was like, oh my God. And so there's nothing more fun. Like, if you cast Brad Pitt, you expect Brad Pitt to be great because he's been great for 30 years, and you kind of know what Brad Pitt's going to do generally. And with Confidants, it was like, oh my God, this guy I've never seen before, and he's a movie star. Like, I believe that. He's just incredible, and he's so charismatic, and he just owned the screen. And every single episode we had a moment like that. And so then, in terms of kind of the actors, some of them were greener than other actors I had worked with, but they were so, like I said before, they were so invested in the material. And they were so open to collaboration and to bring what they were bringing of their own culture. And everything was a conversation, and it just became everything was enriched by their participation. And also it's just, nobody was jaded. There was no one who was like in their trailer, refusing to come out. Like, they were just standing around on set with us and wanting to talk and want to learn about the cameras and wanted to hear from all the different departments. And it really felt like, because it was such an opportunity for so many people, everyone was kind of in it together.
Instead it's like, is it my scene? Is it my scene? Are we going yet? Let's go.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly right.
Amazing. I mean, it's such a stunning show that you've all created, and I'm so excited that we're getting more episodes from it all. And I just wanted to wrap out by sharing this message that we got from Magdi saying, I just want to say I love the show, and as an immigrant, it really resonated with me, and it was nice to see an experience similar to mine, which I thought I'd never get to see on American TV, because I think that's exactly what the show has done. Thank you so much, Lee.
Yeah, thank you for this.
Amazing. Have a great rest of your evening with the dogs.
Yeah, exactly. All right, bye.
Bye.